Hey, hello, and welcome to Science as Process and Perspective. This is the first lecture of the course, and it's a lecture you can skip if you want. That's a good start. What I want to do first here is basically, I want to give you my own example of why I, as a scientist, have become interested in philosophy and have started to publish actually, and do philosophy lately, even. But my interest in philosophy goes way back, long before that time. And also, I think that interest informed how I did science and also shaped my scientific career. So you can see this sort of introductory lecture as a real world example of how philosophy and science can work together. If you're not interested in this particular example, but you just want to learn general principles, then you can skip right ahead to the next lecture. So I want to place my life on this sort of um, world map projection here. And it starts out in Switzerland. Um, this is my hometown, Tierchen, in Switzerland, where I started out, you know, thinking about the world when I was very young as some sort of imperfect place. And it always disturbed me. Switzerland is pretty close to a sort of very neat, perfect setup. But I always imagined when we drove through the landscape how it could be improved, what its ideal state would be. If there were trees falling down in the woods, we would think of how that could be prevented and all that. So basically, I was thinking about an ideal world as something that is sort of static, perfect, eternal. And I didn't realize that what really was happening is everything was actually in motion. And that's why it wasn't perfect. So it was where sort of slowly changing, maybe. But here you see one of these romantic landscapes by Caspar David Friedrich, one of my favorite painters. And you can see that everything is moving. The water is running down. There's erosion. The tree has fallen down. There's a constant coming and going. And the true beauty of what's going on is actually in this permanent, constant change. So this was one of the sort of earlier insights that you could call philosophical, where I realized that this sort of vision of a perfect world is completely asphyxiating, smothering everything, and that all kind of creativity needs change and imperfection. So after I was reading sort of the usual suspects in high school, like Friedrich Nietzsche and others, I didn't have a sort of, I had an interest in philosophy, but not particularly. I wanted to go into science, but I didn't quite know what kind of science I want to study. So I chose biology because that, contained most sort of different subjects that you would learn about. If you study biology, you also learn about physics and chemistry, but not the other way around necessarily. So I went into biology, and after some twists and turns, ended up in the city of Basel in Switzerland, which is here. Doesn't have an arrow here, but should have one. Um, where I did a university diploma in biology and a molecular biology lab. Um, Very famous professor, Walter Gehring, at the time we were studying um, different mutants in flies, fruit flies, and I was in particular looking at these monster sort of flies that had um, antennae growing out of their eyes, all kinds of gruesome stuff. So this was a place where people did amazing experiments, really, really smart, powerful experiments in molecular biology, but the interpretations of those experiments were extremely oversimplified, simplistic, reductionist. And I could not make sense of those. While everybody else was really excited around me, um, the experiments were really interesting and really good. The people were really good in the lab. But then, the sort of conclusions that were drawn, the context in which those experiments were placed, always had to do with some sort of simple genetic switch that caused this organ to grow there. This is how evolution works as well. And so I got extremely frustrated with the sort of ways in which people explain things. And I guess that's the first philosophical turn that I took. I went on then, and I read all these sort of books by Stuart Kauffman, for example, at the time, The Origin of Order. Um, And one book by a guy called Brian Goodwin was called How the Leopard Changed Its Spots. And I was looking up where these people were. Stewart was predicting the stock market at the time, so I think. So I looked up Brian, who was located at this um, little hippie college called Schumacher College in the southwest of England, in Devon, Dartington, Devon. And so I managed to get a fellowship from the Roche Science Foundation, from a Swiss pharmaceutical company, to study at a hippie college. Uh, and I was going to study something that was called a master in holistic science in this wonderful old postern in the countryside in the southwest of England. And so this was a really sort of uh, determining moment for my career, because Brian had set up something really unique. So this was before there was systems biology, really, in 1999. But I was doing sort of, as my hands-on research project, I was doing, making a model of this sort of process. What you see on the left here is a part of a mouse embryo. It's back from the head on top to the tail at the bottom. And what you see are these blocks of tissue along the neural tube, the forming neural tube, that are called somites, that form the vertebrae and sort of segmented pieces of muscle along the body axis. And I was interested in this process that is called somitogenesis. These are the somites. Somitogenesis is how the somites are formed. I was interested in how they formed. And there's a beautiful movie of an explant of a mouse embryo in a dish that shows these beautiful waves of gene expression. I was trying to understand those waves by making a really simple model. So I was programming really simple mathematical models, which was still a sort of a weird thing to do at the time, while at the same time getting philosophy lectures and lectures in ecology and complex systems. And this was sort of 180 degrees from my molecular biology undergraduate diploma. And it was really interesting to compare, to get both of these views, these very different perspectives on life. And I think ever since then, I've taken both of those. I take them really serious, and they don't always match together, but they complement each other in a way. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not competing necessarily. So this was an insight that came very early on. The second insight I gained during that year is that, there's a difference between complicated and complex. Complicated explanations and systems are what we build. Our scientific knowledge, our explanations in science, our technology are complicated. Space shuttle, that was a complicated thing. That's why it failed so often. While complex systems have these very sort of special interdependencies that make them completely unpredictable, uncontrollable in a way, but also very robust, unlike a space shuttle. So less control, more robustness. They're adaptive. They evolve, unlike space shuttles. And so this very basic distinctions was important to me. I also learned a lot of theoretical sort of modeling techniques while working there. And so for my PhD, I moved to the other end of the map here on the right, to Stony Brook, which is on Long Island, just outside New York. And I managed to get a project there where I could combine sort of the molecular biology techniques that I had learned and the modeling for my master's. This was very unusual at the time. So what we were trying to do, I joined the group of John Reinitz, who had this unique sort of data set of quantitative gene expression patterns in a fruit fly. Nobody was actually quantitative in measuring the expression of genes at the time. This was again in the year 2000, when systems biology was still called functional genomics. And so I got to this place at exactly the right time, the right moment. They had a beautiful data set, and what we did there was we modeled that data set. I took that sort of work later on for my postdoc in Cambridge in the UK, in a beautiful museum of zoology, which you can see here. It's now slightly rebuilt, but there's a whale skeleton at the bottom, and you can see the beautiful brutalist architecture. And later on, as a group leader at the Center for Genomic Regulation in Barcelona, where I had my own empirical research group for 5 years. So what we did is we measured these gene expression patterns, specifically in a gene network called the GAP gene network. And we were trying to find out, how do these gene expression patterns differ? How does their regulation differ between different species? So at the bottom of, at the very foundation of my research career was always this question: how do you get to this amazing diversity of shapes um, among living organisms? You can see just a little selection here. These wonderful forms that are incredibly diverse, but show these amazing sort of regularities. You can see a lot of these animals have repeated appendages. They have sort of stripes and dots at the bottom in these butterflies, zebras, and jaguars. You have jellyfish, sea slugs, sponges, and dragonfish on top. And the middle row, this is all a specific sort of family of insects called the tree hoppers that have brought forth all these really alien, amazing sort of forms. You know, you have thorn bugs on the right, you have this ant mimic on the left, and then some sort of properly alien life form with the many sort of pseudo eyes here in the middle. These are all closely related species of insects. And so the amazing thing is that there is an order underlying this sort of amazing diversity. So I became really interested not only in how these forms grow, but how they diversify during evolution. And this is something that carries on in my work till today. So another interesting question is, why are there so many forms we never see? I mean, you see these sort of constructed animals here, and you can immediately see that they're fake. They don't quite fit together. They're structures that never evolve, like wheels in animals. No animal has evolved any wheel-like structure, or vertebrates with arms and wings at the same time, like these two angels here, the archangel Michael treading on the fallen angel down here. And they have arms and independent wings. They can fly and use their arms at the same time, but this never actually happened in vertebrate evolution. Every vertebrate that took to the skies, from birds to bats to winged dinosaurs, converted their arms into wings. And that is because there is no, if you have arms, then there is no attachment site for wings to evolve. So you need to turn your arms into wings. While insects, for example, have 6 legs and wings, which is actually quite practical. So there's no adaptive reason for those structures not to evolve, but there are constraints to evolution. So I wanted to understand the regularities, the constraints, and the limits of what evolution can do. And we did this by measuring these gene expression patterns in different species of flies, and then comparing the networks that create these patterns in different species. This is a very complicated diagram that shows you, first of all, the different species we worked with at the top left, and then on the right, you see the sort of different, you see embryos, a bunch of embryos in the different expression patterns and interactions of different genes to create them, and different mechanisms and network diagrams. So this was both quantitative molecular and developmental genetics, and also modeling of entire gene networks through mathematical models. And very early on during my PhD, when we tried to publish this kind of stuff, we got extremely hostile reviews. Okay, and this is something that went on through my career. People were really sort of aggressively against what we were doing. It was quite new at the time, 20 years ago. Okay, and so when we got these reviews, what was really striking is that people weren't criticizing how we did things. They were criticizing what we did, and they were criticizing very general things like models. Somebody wrote only 2 years ago in a review, a model is never an explanation in science. And I thought, just going back to my time as an undergrad in this molecular biology lab, this is completely crazy. Okay, so what is happening here? I'm obviously doing something that I find very interesting, that's sort of different, but that isn't accepted at all. Another incident happened when Mike Eisen came to Cold Spring Harbor to give a talk. Everybody was really excited. He was a biologist, a famous biologist who had pioneered the use of what are called microarrays, so measuring the expression of tons of different genes at the time. And so he was standing there saying, you know, if you do something in your PhD and you're not using sequencing data of, you know, sequenced genes, that kind of thing, then you must be a fool. And so I don't know if you remember this, but I went up to him afterwards and introduced myself and said, look, I'm a fool. I do something. I don't use any sequences. I look at the network level. We're trying to find explanations at that level of how patterns have formed. And he was completely flabbergasted. And he was a little offended, I think, at the time. I don't know if he remembers this, but it was quite funny because the assumption was that you needed to explain everything. You would just sequence everything, all the genes involved and all the regulatory elements in the DNA that lead to gene expression, and you would suddenly understand how an embryo is formed. And there was no sort of consideration that you may have to go to different levels of organization, different levels of explanation. And when we tried to publish this stuff, this explains some of the hostility. It was something that people, it's not that people didn't like what we were doing, but it seemed that people didn't understand the question. And what's more, since it was not a question that they were asking, they found it completely outside of what they considered proper science. So this seemed to be very narrow-minded to me at the time. Okay, this whole hostility, first of all, it seemed very competitive, and it didn't allow for different perspectives. While even at that point, intuitively, I didn't know the philosophy yet behind all this. I thought this was just a different way to explain something. It wasn't even in competition with what they were doing. It was simply different. And I thought it was really important that this is different. And I started to read up on for example, process thinking, which is something we will talk about in this course, realizing that I was dissatisfied with the idea of just a list of genes as an explanation for something that happens in an embryo, which is intrinsically a process. The development of the embryo is a process, and then the evolution that creates this great diversity that I was just talking about is also a process. So you have a process within a process, and you need to explain those processes in a process kind of way. But what seemed to be happening is that people identified these things, these sequences that are things that do stuff and then create the pattern. So explanations not in terms of processes, but in terms of substances, things. And that started an interest in the different ways in which you explain things in science, especially in biology. And so I went on my path and started talking to philosophers, and I became interested more and more, especially in process philosophy at the time. Also through my long-term mathematical collaborator, Nick Monk, who I should definitely mention here. So this was a sort of an entry point, but I was still sort of a dilettante philosopher at the time, without much clue of what I was talking about. And so after about 5 years as a group leader in Spain, I got the opportunity to move to Berlin, which is shown down here, an arrow here, where I got to be a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And I had the aim of writing a book about dogma, or basically against or beyond dogma. And so because I was rebelling against the dogma in the science, so I thought basically we've taken a lot of the sort of dogmatic thinking from outside science into science, and that was something that disturbed me. It was a really, again, one of these like defining years, like my year at Schumacher College, which completely turned things around in two ways, in a practical way and a theoretical way. So first I got to hang out with a lot of different people, philosophers, but artists, all kinds of people that were really excellent in their field, and had amazing conversations that showed me two things. First of all, I had no clue about all the kind of stuff that had been done about dogma, so I never wrote that book. I still haven't. I still should, maybe someday. I don't know if I will. But and the other thing was that, I mean, there were so many different ways of looking at things, and it really broadened my horizon. I started to read much more outside my own field again. I started to realize just how much specialization was involved in my career up to that point. And I was doing really interesting stuff, don't get me wrong, but I was sort of ready to move on. I was also very much burnt out by the duties of running a lab group, having little children and all that, and I wanted to sort of look for a sort of a change of direction in my career. And so the practical thing that happened that really changed my trajectory at the time is that the director of a small institute for advanced study in close to Vienna, in Klosterneuburg, it was called the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research. The director had died, and I was asked to apply for that position. And that was a really interesting opportunity for me, because the KLI, as it's abbreviatedly called, was a place at the time where philosophers of biology could meet biologists, and they could work together and discuss together. And so I was really excited to do that. And we had, in the 2 years that I was there, a beautiful cohort of researchers and philosophers, and many lasting collaborations came out of this. So this is where I really got into philosophy in a serious way. So not only did I start collaborations, but these philosophers got me to read stuff. A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about here in this course, actually, I started reading up seriously, and I started to get a better idea of what it actually means to do um, philosophy professionally. Although I had already published a philosophical paper at that time. So, but this is really a serious philosophical term, and I realized that there was a lot of room for philosophy in biology, which is a discipline that is increasingly technology driven. Okay, so it's increasingly going where the technology goes. It's sort of looking for solutions where they can be had instead of tackling its big questions because they're hard to tackle. And so I became interested in questioning that approach and sort of looking at the bigger questions. What is happening to those? Is there really no progress, for example, in our understanding of what life is? Is there no progress in understanding organismic agency, difficult topics? Do we have the right mathematical tools? Do we have the right kind of explanations to tackle these big questions? Very interesting question. The other thing that happened during this time is I became a little increasingly disillusioned with the way that science is done. Although I had a struggle to get funding and stuff published all my life and all my career, it was really during this time that it became really serious. I was hired on the promise at this place to try a different sort of model of research, more transdisciplinary sort of exploratory way of doing research, and a different way of running an institute. But it turned out that a lot of this was unfortunately just a facade, and I wasn't really happy. So I left after 2 years. That I couldn't do what I really wanted to do. And I realized that a lot of what was going on was still sort of centered around just getting money in, getting a sort of a good reputation, and doing the stuff that is sort of noticed by the public as important. While there were really big problems that were increasingly difficult to tackle because they were not funded or fundable anywhere in biology or in philosophy. And so this is where this idea came up that what we really need is a more philosophical biology. Okay, we need a really sort of tightly integrated philosophy and science here, and not just a philosophy of science, but a philosophical biology. And so when I left, so this is this struggle. Well, it didn't end very well. A little bit like the rebels against the empire. That never ends well. Here, Rogue One is my favorite example. Everybody dies. All the rebels are dead at the end. The good guys won, but everybody dies in the process. It's not a very good way of changing something. It's I've been, for my whole life, I've been struggling against some sort of system that prevented me from doing the kind of exploration that I actually wanted to do, from really doing the kind of science that I wanted to do, because it didn't fit in anywhere. And the academic system that we've created is like the evil empire. It prevents people from really doing what they want. You have to sort of fit in like a proper stormtrooper and do the things that your field finds interesting. You have to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that was really difficult. And I also realized that this philosophy thing was more than just an academic drive. It affected more than just, I had really existential questions, not just work-related questions. And while in Berlin, I had come across this wonderful paper by James Conant, who gave a talk there when I was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and it's called "On Going the Bloody Hard Way in Philosophy." This is about the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, which we will briefly talk about at some point during the upcoming lectures here. And so Conant was pointing out that Wittgenstein had these very logical arguments, but in between sort of very personal remarks in his work. And he sort of analyzed this, and he comes to the conclusion that philosophy, as Wittgenstein practiced it, was the bloody hard way, going the bloody hard way in philosophy. And it was not only a way of thinking and working, but a way of living as well. And this was very sort of inspirational because I realized that this sort of way of doing philosophy, Leo Strauss called this the wisdom of the ancients, where philosophy was a lived practice. And we have the wisdom of the moderns is more of an academic philosophy, that we do during our daytime, and then we go home, and it's sort of professional work that we do. This never worked for me. So I realized increasingly that we have to have some sort of really deep philosophical changes in society, not just in the way that academia is run, but the way that society is run. And this is something for a completely different course, but it's been a sort of a great inspiration. And so after I left the KLI, I went on to different places. I went to the Center for Systems Biology in Dresden. I went to the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Paris, and the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. And so my time in Paris at the CRI was a sort of another defining moment where I learned about the open science movement and started thinking about the broader philosophical implications of what you need in academia to sort of make open, sort of more inclusive sharing sort of models that are less competitive than the ones that we currently have, if we want to make them succeed. So this is another branch of philosophy that we can talk about in this course that I don't cover explicitly very much in the lectures. I do a little bit, but it's the way that we organize academic research right now is very competitive. And this is sort of good in some ways, it keeps people on edge, it keeps people productive. But on the other hand, if you have too much competition, too much pressure for productivity, you force people into sort of short-term thinking and going for the low-hanging fruit and not tackling the high-risk, sort of deep, big challenges and questions in your field anymore. And I think we're increasingly driving academia into a corner, academic research into a corner out of which is very difficult to get out of with this ultra-competitive system. So I dropped out of this system, and I've never been happier and more productive, I must say, in my entire academic life than I am now, doing this sort of freelance stuff, doing what I really want to do. So this is basically three things. One is sort of a philosophical discussion about how we do academic science, a very process-oriented view, a perspectivist view of science that I'm going to present here. I'm continuing with my academic research in evolutionary biology. I'm interested in a bunch of questions that I will come to in a minute. And I'm also sort of trying to combine art and science at the moment to really open up people's minds to different kinds of thinking. And I think these sort of very radically transdisciplinary projects have huge potentials to get us out of the habits of thinking. We'll talk about habits of thinking quite a bit. So this sort of nomad life this year culminated in a brief visit to South Africa, the Stellenbosch Advanced Study Institute, and also sort of this sort of being outside the system, looking in suddenly. It was a little anxiety inducing in the first place, but it also opened up my mind and sort of made me realize that you cannot fight this system. It's huge, okay? So it makes no sense to sort of fight it and try to change it. Instead, what we should try to do is it's hugely competitive. What we should try to do is we should create these little spaces where we can think, where we can explore, where we can ask different kinds of questions, take different kinds of perspectives. And here's Buckminster Fuller in front of one of his wonderful Bucky domes that he constructed. And he was saying, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So this is now a new kind of project, is to build these spaces where people can explore and or step out of their daily routines and habits. And so, as I said, the last time I did this was in a brief visit to this wonderful place here on the lower left in South Africa, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, when the COVID crisis hit, and made me sort of come back to Vienna and actually put a lot of my lectures online, just like this one. This is now my philosophy course going online. And although this came as a shock to a lot of people and to the whole system, I think it's a unique opportunity to rethink the sort of way in which we do teaching, because that also education teaching needs a really, really fundamental revision. So I'm really sort of fond of this idea of having online lectures that you can look at your own leisure, your own time. You can rewind, you can look at the lectures whenever you want, as many times as you want, and then spending the actual online, or on-site time in discussions. So this is what this course is trying to do. It's not just trying to present philosophy for scientists, but it's also trying to live this philosophy by putting its lectures online and then spending the entire time in the actual course discussing the sort of problems that people actually have. So why do I start with this personal story? I want to show you that, first of all, um, philosophy can have a very sort of concrete influence on how you do science. It always has shaped the way I've done science, the kind of questions I've asked. This is always important. What are the kind of questions you're asking? What are the kind of explanations that you're after? Think about those things, reflect about them. This will make you a better scientist. It will make you ask different questions. It will make you formalize these questions in a better, more rigorous way and communicate them in a way that other people can understand. So that's a way in which philosophy is immediately practically important. I also think that the way we do academic research needs to change in very fundamental ways over the next few decades. And having this sort of philosophical background is going to be very helpful to understand what kind of changes will be required. And the third thing, of course, is I find it an absolute scandal and absolutely sad that we do not teach researchers philosophy anymore. So we are missing the sort of context that we're doing our research in. And this course is also trying to provide a little bit of that context. So what I'm doing these days is could sort of be entitled, we're trying to go in general beyond sort of a network view of life, a machine view of life, towards a more organic view of organism-centered biology that takes the organism and its agency really serious. So this is what I mean by philosophical biology. It is biology what I'm doing, theoretical biology, but not theoretical biology in the sense of doing modeling or something like I started out with. It is theoretical biology in the sense of questioning some fundamental concepts and approaches that we use to study life in the lab. And I think across scientific discipline, we could use a lot of this sort of fundamental rethinking, reflection of what we're actually, about what we're actually doing. And so for me, this has taken a very serious turn. I am now publishing mostly philosophical papers, which, as I said, I call philosophical biology, with actual philosophers. Really beautiful collaborations that I'm quite proud of. So I don't want you to turn into philosophers. For me, this has happened, but I want you to realize that philosophy can have really practical sort of boosts, boons for you to do your science, to understand how science is done, and also to understand how academic research needs to change in the future to fulfill its promise and its duty, its role in society. With that, I will finish this lecture with just some sort of interesting questions. So every lecture for this course is seeded with these sort of questions. I want a question-oriented approach. Where do our questions come from? What are the questions we're asking? What are the important questions in your field? That's much more important than knowing the facts. So here are some really interesting biological questions. What are the limits of mechanistic explanation in biology? Very few biologists are asking this. I don't think we can explain organisms using mechanistic explanation. And I'm very happy to discuss this offline. But that's a big part of my work right now. How do organisms maintain their identity and reproduce? We don't know. And molecular biology is never going to tell us that. What kinds of causes are involved? How do they interact? How do genes act? What does that mean that genes act or do something in a complex systems sort of environment? What makes living systems robust, yet adaptable, evolvable? These are unanswered questions that can only be asked and answered at a system level, sort of, not if you're only going to, sequence things. What is agency? And how do we explain the agency of organisms? In fact, I do think we misunderstand what agency is, especially in artificial intelligence research. That's a very interesting question. How does the agency of organisms affect evolutionary change? We have no idea. That's not a question that is unanswered. It's a question that is basically unasked by biologists today. And what is the fundamental nature of change itself? It's really hard. And that's a question that I'm really busy with. We're writing a paper on this topic. So these are sort of philosophical questions that affect science, the science I come from, biology, in a very direct way. But there are questions like that in any sort of discipline. And this is a course, of course, for all kinds of researchers from all kinds of disciplines. So my example here comes from biology, but there are similar arguments to be made from all kinds of other disciplines. I just wanted to give you an example of my own story. First of all, you know a little bit more about myself. And I wanted to give you a sort of very rough first impression of how philosophy has shaped my trajectory and how it has allowed me to ask different kind of questions and write different kinds of papers. And so I want to end this introductory lecture with a simple quote from Alfred North Whitehead, one of my favorite process philosophers. He says, "Seek simplicity and distrust it." So this is going to be the motto for the rest of this course. We're going to try and find the simplest answers that we can and then sort of deconstruct them and see where they hit their limitations. So after this brief personal introduction, we'll dive right in with the question of what philosophy actually is, what science actually is, what knowledge is, and how philosophy and science interact, how they should interact as well. We'll talk about all these things the next time. I hope you'll tune in again. Thanks for listening. Goodbye now.